You are 7 years old. Your home is a small Christian village in the rugged hills of the Balkans. The day begins like any other, chasing chickens across the yard, laughing with your cousins, your mother calling you in for bread. But then a sound cuts through the air, a pounding at the wooden door. It is not the knock of a neighbor. It is firm, official, merciless. Your father stiffens. Your mother goes pale. Because the Ottoman officials have arrived. They are not here for grain, not for coin, not even for soldiers. They are here for you. Before the sun sets, you will be gone from this place forever. Your name will be stripped from you, your language silenced. Your mother's cries will echo in your ears until even those memories fade into something you once dreamed. This moment, the sudden rupture of childhood, was repeated across villages, from Albania to Greece, from Serbia to Bulgaria. For 6 long centuries, the Ottoman Empire ruled as one of history's most enduring powers, stretching across 3 continents, reaching from the deserts of Arabia to the gates of Vienna. Today, we remember its domes of shining stone, its mighty armies, its intricate palaces, its sultans wrapped in silks and authority. The architecture still stands, the names of great rulers are still whispered in textbooks. But what do we not remember? What lies behind the marble, the banners, the military triumphs? In the shadows of conquest and trade, the Ottomans cultivated policies so dark that even contemporary observers, diplomats, travelers, priests, hesitated to record them plainly. Sexual practices so organized, so systematic, that they transformed the most intimate aspects of human life into instruments of power and control. And here lies the unsettling truth. This was no accident, no set of isolated crimes. It was a machine, designed, recorded, maintained with bureaucratic precision. The same empire that tallied taxes and arranged armies also kept ledgers of children seized, bodies mutilated, and lives redirected to serve its will. Meticulous Ottoman scribes documented details that still sit in archives today, their neat handwriting preserving unspeakable policies with the same care as they listed bushels of wheat or the wages of soldiers. Consider what that means. Centuries of records that tell us not only of battles fought, but of boys cataloged by height, by beauty, by promise. Documents that coolly described forced castration, the movement of children across provinces, and the management of entire slave markets as if they were legitimate state enterprises. The scale is what chills the blood. This was not random cruelty. It was systemic, institutional, rationalized. The exploitation of human sexuality, of children, women, and men became a pillar of imperial governance. To understand the empire, we must confront this hidden structure, for it shaped millions of lives. Historians call these policies dark history, but the truth is they were once everyday reality. Villagers lived in fear of the knock. Families mourned without graves. Children grew up in gilded cages where even their most private selves were not their own. Some became soldiers, others courtiers. Many never lived past their first ordeal. As we open this story, you must understand, the Ottomans were not careless about these practices. They were deliberate. Every child taken, every body altered, every marketplace of flesh was part of a method that endured for centuries. It is this methodical nature, the coldness with which humanity was reduced to numbers, that remains the most haunting. And yet the records survive. They sit in archives, in Istanbul and beyond, fragile papers that whisper the truth to anyone willing to listen. Archaeologists uncover the remnants of execution sites, bones scarred by torture. Letters from ambassadors describe what they witnessed in half-coded horror. Accounts from survivors and families, though rare, reveal a silence deeper than words. This is not history that flatters. It does not glow with the romance of minarets or the glory of cavalry charges. It forces us into the dark rooms of empire to see what was hidden behind the curtains. And it begins with perhaps the most devastating system of all, a policy so psychologically destructive that its victims lost not only their homes, but their very selves. It was called the Devshirme, the child levy, or as villagers named it with trembling lips, the blood tax.
Every few years, the dreaded cycle returned. Ottoman officials, stern and precise, rode into Balkan villages with scrolls in hand. They were not improvising. They carried ledgers already filled with numbers. How many families lived in this region? How many boys of the right age should be taken? And when the village had last been forced to contribute? The empire knew exactly what it was coming for. This was the Devshirme, the blood tax, and it was unlike anything else in history. Where other empires demanded gold or grain, the Ottomans demanded children. Not just any children, Christian boys taken from their homes and transformed into instruments of the state. The practice served two purposes at once: to drain the Christian communities of their strongest sons, and to fuel the empire's need for soldiers and servants entirely loyal to the Sultan. For families, the process was a nightmare with no defense. Officials would arrive in groups, accompanied by soldiers. They marched straight into villages, unrolling their registers, calling out names like butchers calling for livestock. Mothers clutched their sons, sometimes smearing ash on their faces, disfiguring them with burns or broken teeth in desperate attempts to make them appear undesirable. But the officials were practiced. They looked past tears and wounds. They were trained to spot strength and beauty, and they would not be denied. Boys between the ages of 7 and 20 were potential targets, though the preference was younger. The empire wanted pliable minds, children who could be reshaped. Some records even mention boys as young as 4, babies hardly able to walk, dragged screaming from their mother's arms. The younger the child, the easier it was to strip away his identity and write upon him the script of empire. Imagine the scene. Villagers pressed together in the square, every mother holding her son tighter, father standing powerless, officials pacing with sharp eyes. The chosen children were lined up, inspected like horses at a market, their teeth checked, their bodies prodded for strength. They were not simply collecting human tribute, they were performing an inspection, reducing boys to units of value. And behind the cold cruelty was cold logic. The Ottoman system was terrifyingly efficient. Villages were selected in rotation so that one community would not be depleted too quickly. Officials marked down how many children had already been taken, ensuring a steady supply of flesh for the empire's machinery. It was, in essence, a form of population management, a human harvest, carefully scheduled to yield maximum return without killing the field. But for the families left behind, efficiency meant little. Once a boy was taken, there was no promise of return. Parents were forbidden to follow, forbidden even to know where their sons were being sent. The silence that followed was part of the design. By severing the bond between family and child so completely, the empire erased not just one life, but generations of memory. And yet, for the Ottomans, this was not an act of cruelty for its own sake. It was statecraft. The Devshirme fed directly into the veins of the empire, supplying the Janissary Corps, the palace guard, and the very machinery of government. The levy was not a side practice, it was central to Ottoman power. Even European observers, horrified as they were, admitted the system's effectiveness.
Foreign diplomats wrote of villages emptied, of mothers collapsing in grief, of boys vanishing into palaces and barracks, never to be seen again. But they also noted how this levy produced some of the empire's most loyal and disciplined soldiers. The paradox was unmistakable. The same system that destroyed families also built the military engine that kept the Ottomans in power for centuries. Still, for those who lived under its shadow, the blood tax was remembered not for its efficiency, but for its terror. Songs, folk tales, and whispered prayers survive from Balkan traditions, carrying the memory of the knock at the door, the wails of mothers, and the footsteps of boys dragged away. These oral histories remind us that while the empire saw statistics, the villagers saw only absence. An empty chair, a broken family line, a child who never came home. And this was just the beginning. For the boys who survived the levy, the ordeal had only begun. Their lives were to be stripped down and rebuilt, their very identities ground into dust and rewritten by the empire.
The gathering in the village square was not simply a seizure. It was a ritual, rehearsed countless times across centuries. Ottoman officials carried themselves with the detachment of seasoned traders, for, in truth, that is what they were. They were not merely choosing children, they were appraising stock. Each boy was examined as if he were a colt at an auction. The brightness of the eyes, the straightness of the back, the strength of the limbs, all weighed silently, all entered into mental tallies that reduced human life to categories of usefulness. The inspection was methodical. Officials would kneel to look at the teeth, pull at the arms to feel for muscle, even question the boys to test their intelligence. They were not only selecting bodies, they were selecting futures. Some children were too frail, too visibly resistant, and they were dismissed. But for the healthy, the promising, the beautiful, there was no escape. Once chosen, the child was marked for transformation. From that moment, his old life was already over. His name would be stripped from him. Within days, he would be forbidden to speak his mother tongue. Within weeks, he would be taught to see his parents not as beloved family, but as infidels, people to be pitied at best, despised at worst. This was not just the theft of children, it was the calculated destruction of identity. The empire understood something chillingly modern, that children are blank slates. A 7-year-old torn from his home could be made to forget it. A 10-year-old could be broken and remade. Even an adolescent of 15 with resistance in his veins could be bent under sufficient pressure. The Ottomans knew this, and they built their system upon it. The psychological violence was relentless. Boys were forbidden to use their birth names. They were punished if caught whispering in their old language. They were separated from anyone who might remind them of home. Any display of longing for family, tears, hesitation, even the memory of a lullaby was beaten out of them. Some accounts describe children, after only a year, struggling to remember the faces of their parents, their original names dissolving like ink in water. In this enforced forgetting, the empire was not unique, but it was extreme. Other powers in history had absorbed conquered peoples. Romans drafting slaves into households, Mongols forcing captives into their ranks. But the Ottomans elevated the practice into an institution, codified in law, managed in registers, and ritualized through repetition. They did not merely conquer armies, they conquered childhood itself. Imagine being 7 years old, hearing the voice of your mother crying as you are marched away. At first you whisper her name at night, trace the memory of her face in your mind. But weeks pass, months, and no one speaks that language anymore. Every sound around you is foreign. Your instructors beat you when you stumble on new words. They rename you, Mustafa, Ibrahim, Ali, and you are forced to answer until the sound of your own birth name fades like a dream you no longer can recall. The cruelty of the Devshirme was not in the initial capture alone,
but in this slow erosion. By the time the boy reached manhood, he was a stranger even to himself. His loyalties had been reforged, his sense of self written over by the empire's script. He no longer remembered the village square, or the ashes his mother smeared on his cheeks to try to save him. He was a servant of the Sultan now, body and soul. This was the true genius and horror of the Ottoman system. It did not simply seize bodies, it remade identities. And for those who survived the ritual of selection, new paths lay ahead, each darker than the last. Some would march into the barracks of the Janissaries, others would vanish into the gilded prison of the palace, but all had been stripped down to nothing, made into vessels for the empire's will.
For the boys marched away under Ottoman banners, the world split into different fates, each path a reshaping of their stolen lives. Some would enter the grinding discipline of the Janissary Corps, forged into the empire's most feared soldiers. Others, deemed bright or beautiful, would be reserved for the palace itself, destined to serve in ways more intimate, more insidious than the clash of swords. And yet, regardless of their path, one thing united them: the empire's determination to strip them of their former selves and rebuild them as instruments of power. The process began with separation. Children were scattered deliberately, never allowed to remain with others from their village or even from their language group. The policy was calculated. If a boy could not speak to his peers, he could not reminisce, could not cling to the remnants of his old life. This was a prison without walls, a cage made of silence and isolation. The empire knew the mind breaks more surely when it has no voice. Those marked for military service were trained with merciless efficiency. The Janissary path seemed, on the surface, almost honorable: discipline, order, brotherhood. But beneath the veneer was another kind of theft. Janissaries were denied wives, denied children, denied family ties of any kind. Their only devotion was to be to the Sultan. What should have been the natural bonds of love and kinship were redirected into the cold machinery of empire. A Janissary might rise to glory on the battlefield, but at the cost of never truly belonging anywhere except the shadow of the Sultan's will. For others, the fate was more gilded, but no less cruel. The most intelligent, the most striking in appearance, were led toward the palace schools. There, conversion to Islam was swift and total. They were taught languages, calligraphy, politics, and the art of courtly obedience. They learned to move silently in gilded halls, to bow at the correct angle, to anticipate the Sultan's desires before they were spoken. This education was no act of kindness. It was a complete psychological reconstruction. Each lesson was designed not merely to instruct, but to erase, until the boy who once ran barefoot in a Balkan field no longer recognized the sound of his own laughter. And why children rather than captured men? The answer lies in pliability. Adults resist. Adults remember too vividly what was taken from them. A man might submit under duress, but his soul remains a battlefield. A child, by contrast, can be reshaped. His loyalties are not yet fully formed, his memory still soft. By seizing boys young, the empire could mold them into soldiers who would fight against their own people without hesitation, or courtiers who could serve a sultan they once would have feared. It was power refined into its most efficient form, the remaking of identity itself. Historical echoes remind us that this practice was not unique in intent, but in execution. Rome had once integrated slaves into households, forcing them to forget their pasts through daily labor. The Mongols had seized the sons of conquered princes as hostages, raising them in foreign courts to ensure loyalty. But the Ottomans perfected the system, institutionalizing it across generations. They created an engine of assimilation so relentless that it became part of the empire's very bloodstream. And so, paths diverged.
Some marched toward the drill grounds, where wooden swords would be replaced by steel, and discipline would hammer them into soldiers who belonged to no family but the corps. Others walked through palace gates, where they would shed not only their names, but their entire childhoods, becoming servants who could not even remember they had once been free. The brilliance of the Ottoman state lay in this duality. The devshirme did not only weaken conquered peoples by draining their sons, it simultaneously strengthened the empire by transforming those sons into its fiercest instruments. A system that destroyed and created at once, turning grief into empire. For the boys themselves, however, there was no such balance. Whichever path they walked, it led away from home, away from the embrace of family, and into a future where even their own sense of self was no longer theirs to keep.
Among the most famous outcomes of the devshirme was the creation of the Janissary Corps, the Sultan's elite infantry, feared across Europe and admired for their iron discipline. To outsiders, they were the embodiment of Ottoman power, men who marched in perfect unison, who obeyed without question, who fought with a devotion that seemed almost fanatical. But beneath their reputation lay a paradox that reveals the empire's dark genius. The Janissaries were shaped not only through military training, but through a deliberate restructuring of loyalty and personal bonds. From the moment they were taken, boys destined for the Janissary Corps were taught that their only family was the Sultan. They were forbidden from marrying, forbidden from fathering children, forbidden from forming ties that might compete with their devotion to the state. In a world where family bonds were everything, this was a radical act of social engineering. The empire severed natural loyalties and replaced them with a new, artificial one. A loyalty so complete that the Janissaries' very identity was bound to the Sultan's survival. But the denial of family did not mean the denial of companionship. In fact, the empire cultivated an environment in which relationships between soldiers were not only tolerated, but structured into the very fabric of the corps. Among the ranks, a unique culture of close brotherhood developed, sanctioned under the watchful eye of the state. This was not an accidental byproduct of barracks life. It was institutionalized. The most striking example of this was the formation of special battalions designed to strengthen camaraderie. Historical records suggest that these units functioned almost as official channels for personal relationships within the Janissary Corps. Rather than suppressing these bonds, the empire harnessed them, turning private attachments into instruments of cohesion and control. In an army where soldiers were forbidden wives, forbidden families, the bond between comrades became both emotional and practical, ensuring that their only sense of belonging was to one another, and, by extension, to the Sultan. Accounts from European observers describe this system with a mixture of fascination and unease. They noted how advancement within the corps could be influenced by such ties, how younger recruits might find themselves under the authority of higher-ranking officers, and how the line between personal loyalty and military duty blurred until the two were inseparable. A soldier's life was not just his own, it was part of his service to the empire. And yet, this strange arrangement was not without purpose. By channeling emotional energy into controlled bonds within the corps, the Ottomans reduced the risk of disorder. The Janissaries, bound by shared secrets and shared experiences, became not just an army, but a fraternity, a closed world where loyalty to comrades reinforced loyalty to the state. It is tempting to dismiss such practices as aberrations, but the truth is more unsettling. Across history, armies have manipulated personal bonds as a tool of discipline and power. In ancient Sparta, for example, relationships between older and younger warriors were encouraged to strengthen unity in battle. In Rome, loyalty to commanders sometimes extended into the personal sphere. The Ottomans did not invent the link between intimacy and warfare. They perfected it, weaving it into an institutional framework that endured for centuries. The paradox of the Janissary poor, then, is clear. It was both a symbol of discipline and a product of manipulation. These men were feared for their independence on the battlefield, yet in their private lives they were anything but independent. Their identities, their loyalties, even their closest bonds were carefully shaped to serve the state. They were elite soldiers, but also captives of a system that denied them the most basic human freedoms. And for those considered exceptional in talent or appearance, awaited a different path still, a path that led not to the battlefield, but to the palace, where they would serve in ways that further bound them to the Ottoman hierarchy.
Not every boy taken in the blood tax was sent to the barracks. Some were marked for a different destiny, one far more intimate, far more perilous. These were the boys whose beauty or intelligence set them apart during the inspections, whose faces seemed too delicate for the mud of the battlefield. They were not destined to carry muskets in the Sultan's army. They were destined to pass through the iron gates of the palace. At first glance, this seemed like privilege. The palace was a place of gold domes, glittering fountains, and endless courtyards filled with music and intrigue. Here, boys were taught not only Turkish and Arabic, but Persian poetry, courtly manners, calligraphy, and the delicate arts of service. They were given new names, often Arabic or Turkish, and carefully dressed in fine fabrics. To the outsider, it might appear that these children had been elevated, transformed from peasants into princes. But beneath the silks lay a brutal truth. They were property, stripped of their humanity and reshaped to suit the Sultan's desires. For some, that transformation came through the blade. The empire had a constant demand for eunuchs, and the fate of many palace boys was castration. The operation was usually performed far from the empire's heart, in Egypt, in Ethiopia, in corners of the empire where Islamic law could be sidestepped by employing non-Muslims to do the work. It was a ritual of cruelty disguised as practicality, and it was often fatal. The survival rate was horrifyingly low. Historical records suggest that only about 1 in 10 boys survived the procedure. That means that for every eunuch who lived to serve, 9 others died in agony, their blood spilled in the name of imperial order. The Ottoman state was willing to gamble with human life in this way because it valued the result more than the process. To them, the eunuch was worth the carnage, a servant incapable of producing heirs, incapable of creating loyalties outside the palace, bound entirely to the household of the Sultan. Even in survival, distinctions were made. Boys from Africa, subjected to the removal of both testicles and penis, became known as black eunuchs. They were considered safer around the Sultan's women, and often gained influence in the harem, some rising to positions of immense political power. Boys from the Balkans, by contrast, typically endured only the removal of their testicles. They became white eunuchs, suited for administrative tasks or service outside the harem's inner sanctum. It was a grotesque hierarchy built upon mutilation, one in which a boy's race and geography determined not only the violence he suffered, but also the station he might one day achieve. Some eunuchs, through cunning and loyalty, became gatekeepers of imperial secrets, whispering into the ears of sultans and shaping the destiny of the empire itself. Others, broken by pain and humiliation, lived out their days in shadow, nameless and voiceless, their survival a bitter echo of the hundreds who died for every one who lived. For the boys spared the knife, life in the palace was no less suffocating. They became pages, attendants, dancers, and companions, trained to anticipate the Sultan's mood, to serve him in public and in private. Their education was less about knowledge and more about obedience, stripping away will until they became reflections of the empire's power. They were taught not only to serve, but to forget themselves entirely. From the outside, the Ottoman palace was a world of magnificence, but for the boys within, it was a labyrinth of silence and control, where every gesture was rehearsed, every word monitored, every future already decided. They were not being raised to live their own lives. They were being crafted to serve the desires, ambitions, and whims of others. This was the other path of the Devshirme. If the battlefield forged boys into soldiers, the palace forged them into something else entirely, living ornaments of power, reshaped until even their bodies were not their own. For those who survived the blade, life did not return to anything resembling life. The eunuchs of the Ottoman Empire lived in a state that contemporaries sometimes described as worse than death itself, a half-existence in which they were denied not only freedom, but also the most basic human experiences of love, family, and continuity. Their bodies were mutilated, their bloodlines erased, their identities rewritten. The black eunuchs, often boys taken from East Africa and castrated completely, bore the heaviest burden. Their mutilation was absolute, and so, paradoxically, their proximity to power was greatest. They were deemed safe to guard the sultan's women, and in that role many rose to immense authority within the palace hierarchy. The Kislar-Ah, or chief black eunuch, became one of the most powerful figures in the empire, controlling not only the inner harem, but also serving as a political broker between the sultan, the women of the palace, and the bureaucracy beyond. This figure could decide who had access to the sultan, who advanced, and who vanished into obscurity. His word carried more weight than that of generals. The white eunuchs, often boys from the Balkans, endured a different mutilation, removal of the testicles only. Their service was primarily administrative, guarding palace gates, overseeing household staff, or managing the intricate logistics of court life. They too were trusted, because they could not create families of their own, but their roles rarely reached the towering heights of influence that black eunuchs sometimes achieved. But whether black or white, the psychological toll was devastating. They were men who could never truly be men. They could never marry, never father children, never leave a legacy that bore their blood. The rituals of human intimacy, courtship, marriage, the joy of children's laughter were denied to them forever. Their very humanity had been fractured, and in its place was duty, surveillance, and silence. Some sought solace in religion, becoming fervent in their devotions. Others sought influence, building networks of power within the palace walls, their cunning compensating for the life stolen from them. A few embraced cruelty, projecting their suffering onto those beneath them, ensuring that the cycle of fear remained unbroken. All of them, however, lived with the permanent reminder that their survival came at the cost of hundreds of others who had not survived the knife. The empire, in its twisted calculus, accepted this human wastage as natural. If 9 boys died to produce 1 loyal eunuch, that was a price it was willing to pay. The mathematics of empire reduced flesh and blood into fractions, turning children into statistics in the service of power. For outsiders, the eunuchs seemed almost spectral, figures who drifted through the palace like shadows, stripped of masculinity, yet clothed in silks. European diplomats wrote of their eerie presence, watchful eyes, soft voices, a strange authority that made them both feared and pitied. They were both insiders and outcasts, indispensable yet despised. The tragedy of their existence was not only in what was taken from them, but in what they were forced to become. They embodied the empire's contradictions, powerless in their own bodies, yet wielding influence that could alter the fate of sultans, mutilated in flesh, yet central to the machinery of state. To live as a eunuch was to live as a reminder of the empire's cruelty, a body that testified, silently but endlessly, to the violence required to sustain power. For many, it was a living death, an existence caught between survival and annihilation. And yet, as harrowing as this fate was, there were others who suffered in ways different but equally horrific. Not all beautiful boys were turned into eunuchs. Some were chosen instead for performance, for the spectacle of entertainment that masked abuse. They became dancers, dressed not as soldiers or servants, but something altogether more unsettling.
For those who survived the blade, life did not return to anything resembling life. The eunuchs of the Ottoman Empire lived in a state that contemporaries sometimes described as worse than death itself. A half-existence in which they were denied not only freedom, but also the most basic human experiences of love, family, and continuity. Their bodies were mutilated, their bloodlines erased, their identities rewritten. The black eunuchs, often boys taken from East Africa and castrated completely, bore the heaviest burden. Their mutilation was absolute, and so, paradoxically, their proximity to power was greatest. They were deemed safe to guard the sultan's women, and in that role, many rose to immense authority within the palace hierarchy. The Kislar-A, or chief black eunuch, became one of the most powerful figures in the empire, controlling not only the inner harem, but also serving as a political broker between the sultan, the women of the palace, and the bureaucracy beyond. This figure could decide who had access to the sultan, who advanced, and who vanished into obscurity. His word carried more weight than that of generals. The white eunuchs, often boys from the Balkans, endured a different mutilation, removal of the testicles only. Their service was primarily administrative, guarding palace gates, overseeing household staff, or managing the intricate logistics of court life. They too were trusted because they could not create families of their own, but their roles rarely reached the towering heights of influence that black eunuchs sometimes achieved. But whether black or white, the psychological toll was devastating. They were men who could never truly be men. They could never marry, never father children, never leave a legacy that bore their blood. The rituals of human intimacy, courtship, marriage, the joy of children's laughter were denied to them forever. Their very humanity had been fractured, and in its place was duty, surveillance, and silence. Some sought solace in religion, becoming fervent in their devotions. Others sought influence, building networks of power within the palace walls, their cunning compensating for the life stolen from them. A few embraced cruelty, projecting their suffering onto those beneath them, ensuring that the cycle of fear remained unbroken. All of them, however, lived with the permanent reminder that their survival came at the cost of hundreds of others who had not survived the knife. The empire, in its twisted calculus, accepted this human wastage as natural. If 9 boys died to produce 1 loyal eunuch, that was a price it was willing to pay. The mathematics of empire reduced flesh and blood into fractions, turning children into statistics in the service of power. For outsiders, the eunuchs seemed almost spectral, figures who drifted through the palace like shadows, stripped of masculinity, yet clothed in silks. European diplomats wrote of their eerie presence, watchful eyes, soft voices, a strange authority that made them both feared and pitied. They were both insiders and outcasts, indispensable yet despised. The tragedy of their existence was not only in what was taken from them, but in what they were forced to become. They embodied the empire's contradictions, powerless in their own bodies, yet wielding influence that could alter the fate of sultans, mutilated in flesh, yet central to the machinery of state. To live as a eunuch was to live as a reminder of the empire's cruelty, a body that testified, silently but endlessly, to the violence required to sustain power. For many, it was a living death, an existence caught between survival and annihilation. And yet, as harrowing as this fate was, there were others who suffered in ways different but equally horrific. Not all beautiful boys were turned into eunuchs. Some were chosen instead for performance, for the spectacle of entertainment that masked abuse. They became dancers, not dressed as soldiers or servants,
but something altogether more unsettling. Among the most haunting spectacles of the Ottoman world were the Koçak dancers, young boys trained, adorned, and forced to perform as if they were women. Unlike the soldiers drilled into silence or the eunuchs bound in servitude, these children were made into entertainment. Their purpose was not war or administration, but pleasure, their bodies transformed into tools for amusement at feasts, weddings, and palace celebrations. The boys, often chosen for their youthful beauty, were dressed in flowing garments of silk and chiffon, layered with bright sashes that swayed as they moved. Kohl was painted around their eyes, rouge brushed across their cheeks, anklets fastened to their ankles so that every step rang with delicate chimes. They were taught to sway their hips, to bend their bodies in feminine gestures, to mimic the allure of women. To the watching crowd, they became an unsettling spectacle, neither boy nor woman, caught in a liminal performance crafted entirely for male desire. On the surface, the Koçak tradition carried the veneer of art. Songs were written for them, poems praised their grace, musicians accompanied their steps with tambourines and lutes. But beneath this artistry lay a violent truth. These were children, not performers by choice, but captives of a system that sold their innocence as spectacle. Their dances inflamed audiences already intoxicated by drink, and what followed was chaos. Eyewitnesses described scenes of shocking disorder. Men aroused by the dancers would erupt into fights for the chance to claim them. Glasses shattered, daggers were drawn, blood spilled on banquet floors. The very presence of the Koçak was enough to turn gatherings into riots. The boys themselves had no protection. When the crowd surged forward, when hands grabbed at their arms or pulled at their garments, there was no authority to shield them. Their bodies were treated as public property, available to whoever could reach them first. The violence was not incidental, it was part of the experience. Audiences came expecting not only music and dance, but the frenzy that followed, the raw contest over possession. For the boys, this meant a life of constant vulnerability, their performances ending not with applause but with violation. And yet, paradoxically, the Koçak dancers became woven into the cultural fabric of the empire. Miniature paintings depict them. Songs preserve their names. They were celebrated in art while being destroyed in life. This contradiction, glorification, and exploitation fused together is one of the most disturbing features of the practice. A society that could praise their beauty and poetry while simultaneously subjecting them to abuse revealed how thoroughly intimacy had been twisted into power. Over time, the notoriety of the Koçak became so great that authorities attempted to suppress the practice. By the 19th century, the violence associated with their performances had grown too visible, too difficult to contain. The dancers disappeared from official stages, their art reduced to memory, but the legacy remained. Generations of boys had been consumed by a system that turned them into symbols of beauty while treating them as disposable playthings. The Koçak dancers remind us that not all exploitation wears the mask of brutality. Some wears the mask of art, of culture, of entertainment. But behind the music, behind the shimmering fabrics, behind the painted eyes, there was always the same truth. A child, torn from his family, forced to perform a role that blurred his very humanity. And if the Koçak were visible, if their suffering was on public display, however disguised, there were others whose fate was hidden altogether. For some boys, the empire reserved secrecy, locking them away in chambers where no audience could see, where no record would survive except whispers of horror.
For the families left behind, the blood tax was not a single moment of loss, but the beginning of a silence that never ended. Once a boy was taken, his fate disappeared into the vast machinery of empire. No letters came home, no visits were allowed, no word of survival or death ever reached the village. Parents were left with absence, an empty bed, a hollow chair, the echo of a name never spoken again. That silence became its own form of torture, a wound that could not close because it was fed by uncertainty. The Ottomans understood the power of separation. Children were not only taken, they were moved deliberately across great distances, sometimes hundreds of miles from their homes. A boy seized in a Serbian village might find himself in the barracks of Anatolia or in the palace schools of Constantinople, surrounded by languages he had never heard before: Turkish, Persian, Arabic. His native tongue, once the melody of lullabies and prayers, became a forbidden relic. Speaking it risked punishment. Remembering it risked pain. The empire's policy was psychological as much as physical. By scattering children across provinces, the Ottomans ensured that even if a boy somehow managed to escape, he would be lost, unable to navigate his way home, unable even to communicate with those around him. The village he left behind became unreachable, not only in geography but in memory. The conversion process drove the separation deeper still. A boy was renamed, his Christian name erased and replaced with one deemed worthy of empire. He was told that his family were unbelievers, that his childhood faith was false, that his former life had been nothing but ignorance. Sometimes he was forced to spit on a cross or to burn the texts that once guided his family's prayers. In those moments, the break was made complete, not only from family and culture, but from the very memory of belonging. What made this system especially cruel was how it turned love into fear. Parents, desperate to protect their sons, sometimes resorted to acts of mutilation, scarring their faces with burns, breaking limbs, knocking out teeth in hopes that the officials would find them unfit for service. These were not acts of cruelty, but of love twisted by desperation. Parents harming their own children to save them from a worse fate. That such acts became common tells us everything about the terror under which these communities lived. And yet, despite every effort, the system endured for centuries. The silence it created stretched across generations. Villages whispered stories of the boys who never returned. Families carried grief as inheritance, passing down tales of sons and brothers lost to the Sultan's levy. In the Balkans, folk songs survived that mourned the empty fields, the mothers who wailed in doorways, the fathers who aged overnight from the loss. History records the policy, folklore preserves the pain. For the boys themselves, the silence was internalized. Over time, the forbidden language faded. The old prayers slipped from memory. Even their names vanished from their tongues. Within a few short years, many could no longer recall the sound of their mother's voice. What remained was an emptiness, a life reconstructed atop the ruins of another.
The most sinister genius of the Devshirme system was not only that it stole children, but that it transformed those children into the very agents who would sustain the cycle. Boys who had been torn from their families grew into men who returned to the Balkans not as sons, but as instruments of empire. Their memories had been rewritten, their loyalties recast, until the same eyes that once looked out in terror from the village square now scanned other children with calculating detachment. When Ottoman officials rode back into Christian towns to conduct the levy, it was often former captives, now janissary officers or palace administrators, who pointed out which boys should be taken. They moved among the villagers like strangers, unrecognizable even to the mothers who had once held them. Some had risen so high that they were now feared, not pitied. Their presence turned the trauma of the system into something almost unbearable. Victims pressed into the role of perpetrators, carrying out on others what had once been done to them. This cycle of betrayal was not accidental. It was by design. By forcing boys to abandon their identities and embrace the empire's authority, the Ottomans created not just soldiers and servants, but recruiters. Each generation of captives fed the next, ensuring the system's endurance without the empire ever needing to rely solely on outsiders. The machine of trauma became self-perpetuating, sustained by those it had already broken. Some of these men achieved extraordinary power.
A handful of the empire's grand viziers, the highest officials under the sultan, had once been Christian boys taken in the levy. Figures such as Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, born into a Serbian Orthodox family, rose to command the empire's armies and shape its policies. His brilliance as a statesman was undeniable, but his very existence was also a reminder of the system's cruelty. The empire did not merely consume its victims, it remade them into pillars of its own strength. And yet, the psychological cost was immense. Imagine standing in the same kind of village square where you had once wept as a child, now holding the power to decide which boys would be torn away. Did they remember the sound of their own mother's cries when they saw another woman collapse to her knees? Did they feel a pang of recognition, or had the years of indoctrination buried those memories too deeply to resurface? History gives us few answers, but the silence of the sources speaks volumes. What we do know is that many of these men, once absorbed into the Ottoman system, grew to see their origins not as a source of sorrow, but as a mark of shame. To admit their past was a risk of weakness, so they embraced their new names, their new faith, their new loyalty with ferocity. They suppressed the boy within, because survival demanded it. To look backward was to break, and so they looked forward, even if it meant inflicting upon others the same wounds that had once defined them. This transformation, from captive to captor, from victim to enforcer, was the empire's most devastating achievement. It ensured not only compliance, but continuity. It created a cycle in which trauma became tradition, cruelty became inheritance, and memory itself was weaponized. The Devshirme system was not just a levy of children, it was a levy of futures. And as the boys grew into men, they carried with them the scars of what they had endured, scars that the empire reshaped into tools for its own survival. But as devastating as the system was for boys, it was not the only form of sexual exploitation woven into the Ottoman fabric. For women, too, the empire had built a vast machine of commodification and control, one that dwarfed even the blood tax in its scale and efficiency.
If the Devshirme consumed the sons of Christian families, the empire's appetite for women was even greater. So vast, it turned into a marketplace of flesh, operating with the precision of an industry. To the Ottoman rulers, female bodies were not only objects of desire, but commodities to be cataloged, priced, and sold. Their worth determined by age, beauty, and origin. Nowhere was this more visible than in Constantinople, where the slave markets functioned as one of the largest centers of human trade in the early modern world. Travelers who entered the capital often recoiled at what they saw. Rows of women stood on display, their eyes downcast, their bodies examined with the same scrutiny once reserved for horses or cattle. Merchants lifted veils, inspected teeth, pinched skin to test youthfulness, and bargained over prices with chilling detachment. To the empire, this was not cruelty, it was commerce. The system was brutally organized. African women were valued differently from those taken from Europe. Virgins were priced above non-virgins, and girls barely in adolescence fetched the highest sums of all. A young African woman might sell for between 1,500 and 2,500 kurish if destined for domestic work, but if she was deemed suitable for sexual service, her value could double or triple. Women from Greece, Circassia, or the Balkans commanded even higher prices, some selling for amounts equivalent to the fortunes of small estates. And above all stood the category of the odalisques, women selected not merely for beauty, but for the potential to please the sultan or his elite. These captives were placed into specialized training facilities where they were taught the arts of seduction, dance, massage, music, and conversation. Their trauma was polished into refinement, their stolen innocence reshaped into the skills of a courtesans. By the time they entered the harem, they were not merely women, they were finished products, groomed to fulfill the most intimate demands of empire.
For those who bought and sold them, the arithmetic was simple. The more beautiful, younger, and more submissive a girl appeared, the higher her price. For the women themselves, the reality was catastrophic. To be bought was to lose every tie to family, to religion, to community. A slave girl's womb did not belong to her. Her children were property of her master, to be sold, killed, or raised at his whim. Her body was both currency and a commodity, traded in a market where human desire was measured in coin. The scale of the trade was staggering. By some accounts, hundreds of thousands of women were enslaved in Constantinople at any given time. Campaigns into the Caucasus, Africa, and the Balkans were driven as much by the promise of human spoils as by territorial ambition. Military leaders calculated not only land to be gained, but how many women could be seized, how many bodies could be delivered to feed the endless hunger of the markets. What is perhaps most chilling is how normalized it all became. Laws existed not to prevent exploitation, but to codify it. A free woman raped might find her attacker executed, but if a slave woman was raped, the punishment was only a fine, compensation, not for the woman, but for her owner. Rape was not seen as a violation of a human being, but as damage done to property. In this system, women were stripped of every layer of protection. They were not daughters, sisters, or wives. They were merchandise, objects to be bartered, cataloged, and sold. And behind every transaction was a family somewhere, grieving a daughter who never returned, her memory swallowed by the marketplace of empire. The devshirme had stolen sons, but the slave markets of Constantinople devoured daughters, and on a scale so vast that entire generations of women disappeared into its maw.
For the most prized women, capture was not the end of their ordeal. It was the beginning of a carefully designed transformation. Within the empire's walls, the Ottomans established specialized institutions where enslaved women were reshaped into refined companions, destined either for the Sultan's harem or for the households of high officials. These schools were not places of comfort or freedom. They were centers of discipline, where individuality was stripped away and replaced with strict codes of behavior. Here, girls from a young age were instructed daily in music, poetry, and dance. They were taught how to walk with grace, how to present themselves with elegance, how to converse with charm, and how to follow rules of courtly etiquette. Every gesture was rehearsed, every movement designed to project obedience and refinement. Those with exceptional beauty and intelligence were also trained in wit and conversation, for words could elevate one's position as much as appearance. The training was relentless. Mistakes often led to severe consequences, and resistance was met with discipline. Survival depended on adapting quickly. What might appear to outsiders as refinement or sophistication was, in truth, the result of pressure and conditioning, repeated until instinct replaced will. Smiles were practiced, songs carefully instructed, and every display of grace was a reflection of control rather than freedom. Life inside the harem was shaped by constant competition. Contrary to the European imagination of luxury, the harem was not a paradise, but a stage of rivalry. Concubines vied for attention and influence, each hoping to rise in rank. Overseers deliberately encouraged rivalries, ensuring that jealousy and ambition prevented unity. Friendships could exist, but they were fragile, easily broken by suspicion or competition. Yet within this system, some women rose to remarkable positions of power. The Valida Sultan, the Sultan's mother, was often one of the most influential figures in the empire, guiding alliances, advising on state matters, and even shaping imperial decisions. Concubines who bore sons could gain higher status, and sometimes became important political actors themselves. Still,
This power was never fully independent. It was conditional, borrowed, and tied entirely to their role in the imperial structure. The paradox of the harem lay in this duality. Outwardly, it shimmered with silks and perfumes, celebrated in poetry and painting as a realm of beauty and romance. In reality, it was a system where discipline and control were masked as refinement. Splendor concealed struggle, and elegance often disguised hardship. And when youth and beauty faded, many women discovered that their training could not shield them from decline. Some were married into noble households, some reassigned to lesser roles, and others faded quietly into obscurity. A select few, having secured influence through children or political alliances, maintained their position. But for most, the harem was a chapter that ended once their perceived value diminished. The harem, then, was not a sanctuary, but a system, a carefully constructed world where identity was reshaped, where survival depended on adaptability, and where personal freedom was often sacrificed to serve the machinery of empire. Behind the silks and jewels, behind the music and the dances, lay a reality of endurance and transformation, where women became both symbols and instruments of Ottoman power.
Once the training ended, life within the harem unfolded under a strict code of rules, a rhythm shaped not by freedom but by surveillance. Every moment of the women's existence was orchestrated, when they woke, when they bathed, when they ate, when they were summoned. Behind the gilded walls, what outsiders imagined as luxury was, in truth, a prison. Women lived in a labyrinth of chambers, each rank separated from the next. At the lowest level were the odalisks, new recruits, the unproven, those still hoping to climb higher. Above them were the favorites, concubines who had attracted notice. Higher still were the women who bore children for the sultan, revered as mothers of princes. And towering above all was the Valid Sultan, the sultan's mother, a woman whose authority rivaled that of viziers. This hierarchy defined not only privilege, but survival. Daily life was marked by endless rituals. Bathing in the hammam became both a cleansing practice and a stage, where beauty was polished and displayed. Meals were eaten in silence, observed by eunuchs who ensured no words of rebellion spread. Entertainment, music, poetry, or dance was not freedom of expression, but duty. The harem itself was designed as a theater of discipline, ornate corridors that concealed spies, hidden corners where whispers could cost a woman her life. Trust was rare. Women were encouraged to betray one another, to report rivals, to whisper secrets into the ears of overseers. Friendships formed under these conditions were fragile, dangerous, and easily shattered. To survive, many women learned to wear masks, smiling outwardly while hiding grief and fear deep inside. Every laugh, every gesture, every word had to be measured, weighed against the possibility of punishment. The presence of eunuchs added another layer of control. Castrated men, often slaves themselves, acted as guards, instructors, and informants. They were intermediaries between the women and the world outside. Nothing left the harem without passing through their ears. Some eunuchs wielded immense power, capable of elevating one woman while destroying another. For the women, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of choice all passed through this barrier of surveillance. And yet, within this suffocating system, traces of humanity endured. Some women bonded over shared songs from their homelands, whispered prayers in the night, or tales of the villages they had been torn from. Others clung to dreams of escape, though few ever saw them fulfilled. The harem's silken walls muffled screams, but they could not entirely silence memory. The veil, so often depicted as a symbol of mystery, was in truth a shroud. It concealed not only the women's faces, but their suffering, hiding a world where beauty was enforced and freedom extinguished. To the outside observer, the harem glittered with luxury. To the women within, it was an endless performance under unblinking eyes. Inside the harem, survival was never passive. Every gesture, every smile,
Every glance carried weight, for seduction was not simply intimacy, it was strategy, a weapon sharper than any blade. To attract the Sultan's gaze meant elevation. To hold it meant power. To lose it meant descent into obscurity, or worse. The women quickly learned that beauty alone was never enough. The Sultan was surrounded by splendor, by faces chosen from every corner of the empire. What mattered was distinction, the ability to be memorable in a sea of rivals. Some mastered poetry, weaving verses that echoed in the Sultan's mind long after the music stopped. Others perfected the art of silence, allowing mystery itself to draw him closer. A smile held 1,000 meanings. A gesture could be an invitation or a declaration of loyalty. But seduction was not aimed only at the Sultan. The harem was a battlefield of whispers, where alliances with eunuchs, tutors, or attendants could mean survival. Women bribed servants for information. Which concubine had fallen out of favor? Which gifts pleased the Sultan? Which rival was vulnerable? Knowledge was currency, and those who possessed it could tilt the balance of destiny. At the heart of this silent war lay the greatest prize of all: motherhood. To bear a son was to secure a place in history, to transform from concubine to valide sultan, a role second only to the Sultan himself. This ambition turned every corridor into a warpath. Rivalries grew poisonous, with rumors spread like poison, alliances made and broken in shadows, and, at times, mysterious illnesses befalling those who stood in the way. The palace itself amplified the politics of seduction. Behind the walls of Topkapi, spaces were designed to heighten desire and jealousy. The Sultan's chambers were adorned with silks and perfumes, every surface meant to intoxicate. Yet that same chamber was also a stage, where women competed not only for affection, but for survival, performing their roles under the unrelenting gaze of empire. This constant struggle bred paranoia. A woman who rose too quickly risked being accused of witchcraft or manipulation. One wrong word could ignite suspicion. One careless gesture could invite ruin. The higher she climbed, the more precarious her balance became, for the fall was always waiting. And yet within this theater of power, some women thrived. They wielded seduction not only as a means to pleasure, but as a pathway to influence, whispering counsel to the Sultan, shaping decisions of war and peace, directing the flow of gold and appointments. Through charm and cunning, they could bend the will of the empire itself, turning personal desire into political authority. The harem, then, was not merely a prison, it was a crucible. Those who mastered its brutal politics could rise to heights unimaginable for women in the outside world. But every rise came at a cost, paid in betrayal, rivalry, and fear. Seduction was the coin of this realm, but like all currencies, it could bankrupt as quickly as it enriched.
Where power gathers, so too does treachery. Within the harem, intrigue flowed like an invisible current, pulling women into schemes they could not refuse. Behind jeweled doors in perfumed chambers, plots unfolded in silence, delicate as spiderwebs, deadly as poison. Every woman lived with the knowledge that her rival's smile could conceal a dagger. Jealousies brewed not only over beauty or favor, but over survival itself. A concubine who bore a son threatened the ambitions of all others, for her child might one day inherit the empire. And so alliances were forged in whispers and betrayal sealed in the dark. Assassination was rarely crude. No blades flashed beneath the Sultan's gaze. Instead, a cup of sherbet sweetened with poison, a bath laced with venom, or a sudden fever that consumed a healthy body overnight. These deaths were spoken of as fate, but within the harem, everyone understood the truth. fate often wore human hands. The Valide Sultan, ever watchful, often played the role of arbiter, sometimes protecting, sometimes sacrificing, depending on the balance of power. A word from her could save a woman from disgrace or condemn her to oblivion. Her influence made her both shield and executioner, for she ruled with the knowledge that one weak link could topple the empire from within. The eunuchs, too, became instruments of intrigue. Trusted with messages, they could be bribed, persuaded, or coerced into delivering false words that sparked chaos. A misplaced letter, a whispered rumor, or a glance reported at the right moment could destroy reputations. Even the walls themselves seemed to carry ears, echoing with secrets that refused to remain hidden. But betrayal did not always wear the face of malice. Sometimes it was born of desperation. A woman might betray her closest friend simply to survive another day, to shield her child, or to escape punishment. In such a world, loyalty was fragile, a fleeting gift that could not be trusted to endure. These intrigues did not stay confined within the harem. They rippled outward, shaping politics at the highest level. A favored concubine might whisper in the sultan's ear, urging him toward war or peace. A rival might spread lies to weaken her influence. Court officials beyond the harem's walls often found themselves caught in struggles they could not see, manipulated by voices hidden behind veils. The harem, then, was not merely a place of silken beauty. It was a forge of ambition, a theater of betrayal, a crucible where power was tested through cunning as much as through desire. For every song sung, for every dance performed, another scheme lurked in the shadows, proof that beneath the glittering facade lay a battlefield where victory was survival and defeat was death.
Amid the silks and shadows, not all women were swallowed by fear. Some, with eyes sharp as blades and minds honed by patience, transformed intrigue into opportunity. They understood the harem not as a prison, but as a ladder, each rung built of wit, charm, and unyielding will. It was in this crucible that legends were born. Women who began as nameless concubines rose to wield power greater than pashas, viziers, even sultans themselves. Their weapons were subtle, a perfectly chosen word, a moment of silence, a glance that promised more than it revealed. Through these tools, they shaped policy, shifted alliances, and directed the currents of empire. The most powerful of them all was the Valide Sultan, the sultan's mother. Once she had borne a son and he ascended the throne, her transformation was absolute. From a concubine behind closed doors, she emerged as the empire's matriarch, seated in chambers where even viziers bowed their heads. She commanded the harem, but her reach extended far beyond its walls. Ambassadors sought her favor, generals listened to her counsel, and court officials trembled at her displeasure. History remembers women like Hurrem Sultan, who captured the heart of Suleiman the Magnificent and bent the empire to her will. Through her mastery of intrigue, she became not only his confidant, but his political partner, influencing treaties, shaping succession, and rewriting the destiny of the Ottoman throne. Her rise was not an accident. It was the culmination of calculated patience, relentless ambition, and unbreakable resolve. But Hurrem was not alone. Others followed, each carving her own legend in the empire's chronicles. Some ruled with a mother's fierce protection, ensuring their sons' futures by eliminating rivals. Others embraced diplomacy, weaving networks of allies that rivaled the viziers themselves. Each path was dangerous, for power drew enemies like moths to flame. But those who succeeded reshaped the meaning of sovereignty. The Sultan, though supreme, was never untouched by their influence. In his private chambers, where politics and intimacy blurred, a single woman's whisper could alter the fate of armies.
a promise uttered in the night, could bloom into conquest by morning. The empire itself seemed to pulse in rhythm with these unseen voices, as if the harem were its hidden heart. Yet with power came peril. The higher a woman rose, the more fragile her position became. Rivals plotted, viziers resisted, even the sultan's affection could cool. Every victory carried within it the seeds of downfall. And still, these women pressed forward, for they knew that in the Ottoman world, obscurity was death, but power could make them eternal.
There came a time in Ottoman history when the whispers of the harem grew louder than the commands of the throne. Historians call it the Sultanate of Women, an age when mothers, consorts, and queens behind the latticework seized the reins of empire and ruled with unseen hands. It began with Hurrem Sultan, whose rise shattered centuries of tradition. Once a slave from foreign lands, she became not only the beloved of Suleiman the Magnificent, but also his legal wife, an honor no concubine before her had claimed. From her chambers, she influenced diplomacy, reformed charitable works, and guided imperial succession. Her story was not just survival, it was transformation. After her, others followed. The Valide sultans, mothers of reigning rulers, became the empire's true power brokers. While their sons bore the title of sultan, it was often their mothers who made decisions that shaped the destiny of millions. They appointed viziers, oversaw palace politics, and sometimes even controlled the treasury. Their seal, though hidden behind the veil, carried the weight of law. During this era, the empire was as much a matriarchy as it was a monarchy. The harem's walls no longer confined these women. They became the very stage upon which history unfolded. Alliances with foreign powers, peace treaties, even wars were influenced by their counsel. European ambassadors, aware of their sway, often sent gifts and flattery not to the sultan, but to his mother. Yet this power was fragile, balanced upon the volatile tides of court life. A Valide sultan's reign endured only so long as her son lived and trusted her counsel. When he died, her power vanished like smoke, unless she secured influence through grandchildren. Rival mothers plotted ceaselessly, each determined that her son would wear the crown. Thus, the Sultanate of Women was both an age of glory and an age of endless peril. But in its legacy, we find something extraordinary. In a world where women were often silenced, the Ottoman harem became the unlikely cradle of female sovereignty. Behind gilded screens, these women wrote their own history, turning a prison of walls into a palace of power. It was not the sword, but the veil that shaped the empire. And in that paradox lies the mystery of the Sultanate of Women, a time when shadows ruled the throne, and the destiny of nations was decided by voices no soldier ever heard.